Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final verdict on the newest lens from Irix. Irix is a Swiss-based company with manufacturing in Korea, and this is their third lens and the most unique of their lenses so far, at least in terms of the pattern that they had. To this point, they had a 15mm F2.8. I reviewed it last year, along with an 11mm F4 lens, so both very wide-angle lenses. They've kind of gone to the other end of the spectrum here with a 150mm F2.8 macro lens. This is a 1:1 macro lens, and so obviously a departure both in terms of focal length and in terms of purpose. And so today we're going to give you a thorough breakdown of the lens itself, how it performs, and whether or not it might be a lens worth considering for you. Now, if you missed my first look episode, in that episode I break down the build and the handling, all of the various details as it comes to that. A few things that I will highlight from that episode, however, and if you want more information, I recommend that you watch that episode and get the full details. But a few things that I'll highlight here is that, number one, I will say that this is a lens coming to the market at under $600 US. And so it's a really, really competitively priced lens, particularly when you look at the build grade. This is basically all metals in the barrel of the construction. It has a nice, particularly at this price point, it has to include a tripod collar and a tripod foot is a very, very nice option. I don't know of any other macro lens in this price range that has a tripod collar included with it. And so you can, of course, rotate it. It is also fully removable. And so that's also a very nice option. And of course, while the weight of this lens is only moderate, it's not like an excessively heavy lens. It comes in at 1.8 pounds or 840 grams. And so, I mean, the weight doesn't necessarily demand putting a tripod collar on it. But certainly with a macro lens, particularly one with a longer focal length like this, you're probably going to want to do all of your macro work on a tripod. And what a tripod foot enables here is for you to get a much better balance point with a lens like this. And so that rather than trying to balance the lens body itself, with all of that weight and length at the front, you instead have a balance point here that's going to make it a whole lot easier to do what you want to do when it comes to that. And so I think that's a very, very nice inclusion, and it's well executed. Another well executed trait here is that it has a really nice manual focus ring. This is a manual focus only lens, and so it's a kind of a pebbled rubberized surface here, and it has this unique ridge notch on it that gives you kind of number one, a unique place to grasp, but also I think if you're looking through a viewfinder, it does give you a unique, kind of tactile feedback that a lot of lenses, well, obviously no other lens that I've reviewed has, that can help you to have a sense of where you are, particularly as you gain familiarity with it. A few other things that are important. It does have a tension ring here, and the tension ring will allow you to slide it into the lock position. And so if there's a certain focus position you want to hold, you can lock that down. But also, if you just do a little bit of that tension, you can also introduce just a little bit more drag into the focus ring. And I think that in some situations, you'll actually prefer that, particularly when you're trying to do really finite little focus adjustments at macro focus distance, where of course depth of field is incredibly small, and that's really true with a lens that has 150mm focal length. It means that depth of field is incredibly small at macro distances, and so to have a little bit more precision, and a little more resistance there, I think is a nice touch. The lens is also weather sealed. It has a gasket at the lens mount along with 5 internal seals. And so a really nice construction grade that belies this price point. The lens hood is included along with a really, really clever case that I detailed in that first episode. The lens hood itself is a plastic accessory, nothing particularly special about it. That being said, if this were a Canon lens at this price point, it wouldn't include that, and certainly wouldn't include the tripod collar. And so some really nice handling features that are there. Now, Irix lenses, while they are manual focus only to this point, They do have an electromagnetic aperture iris, and so you control the aperture from within the camera just as you would any other lens. And on the note of that aperture iris, it is an 11-bladed aperture, and my experience is that it does a better job of retaining a circular shape when stopped down than, say, the Canon 100mm F2.8 LIS, a lens that I own and I used as a benchmark in this comparison. I find that the Irix lens does a better job of retaining a circular shape without betraying the shape of the blades or the aperture iris when the lens is stopped down to smaller apertures. So kudos to Irix on that. A lot of great things that they have accomplished. In terms of the raw physicals of this lens, it is 3.4 inches in diameter by about 5 inches in length, or 87 millimeters by 128 millimeters. And I will also note that it has a 77 millimeter front filter thread, and so, you know, a nice common one. And Irix actually has, I've been using their 77 millimeter circular polarizer quite a bit on the lens because their lineup of filters are very, very competitively priced, seem to be very nicely made and optically pure. And so it's been a nice addition to that. And I will cover those edge filters separately at a later date. So anyway, in terms of the raw physical characteristics, there's a lot that I like in the construction of this lens, a lot of great things. Now, before I go further, I will highlight two things that can be a factor here as it applies to build. As I've noted, it is manual focus only. Now, for macro work, not really a big deal. Most true macro photographers actually prefer manual focus because, again, because depth of field is so small, it can be difficult to get a focus point where you actually want to focus, and autofocus is not necessarily helpful always in those situations, and so a lot of times we would prefer to switch into manual focus. So better to have a lens, if you're going to manual focus anyway, that's actually designed for manual focus with a better quality, you know, not only focus feel, but also a better focus throw. And in this case, I estimate it's about 285, 290 degrees of focus throw. And so enough to be very, very useful and to allow you for precision in that. And so, you know, that's not necessarily a big deal. However, if you're shooting other things, manual focus is much more difficult, particularly on DSLR bodies. And this is designed with a Canon EF mount, with Nikon F, and then with a Pentax K mount. All of those, of course, DSLRs with all of the limitations for manual focus that DSLRs have. In many ways, I wish that this was a lens that had been designed, say, for Sony FE, and actually used it a fair bit on a Sony body via adapter, and it worked well there. However, I will note that I first tried to use it with my preferred adapter, which is the Sigma MC11, and for whatever reason, I've never encountered this before, it wouldn't ratchet on, bayonet on quite perfectly, and so it never would fully engage. So I couldn't use that, even though I could use, you know, this other Irix lens via the MC11. Ended up using another adapter I have from Velo, and it worked fine there, but just maybe it's copy specific, but a little bit of a quirk that I encountered. But on Sony, of course, you get all of the manual focus aids, which help a lot. It'll definitely help your keeper rate because, you know, even at a portrait distance, you know, I did a brief portrait session at about a distance of 12 to 13 feet, a little over 3 meters, maybe between 3 and 4 meters. I found even at that distance, depth of field is so tiny, and of course, focus screens are not super precise in DSLRs, and I found that my keeper rate of focus nailed wide open was, you know, probably no more than 20%, you know, and so not fantastic. You know, I switch over to Sony A7R Mark III, and with the manual focus aids there and the ability to magnify focus to confirm, well, my keeper rate went up to basically 100%. So yes, you can go into live view on this, but if you have any familiarity with shooting live view and a longer focal length, it's not always easy. You know, things are moving around, and that leads me to the second point. This is a lens and a focal length that would certainly benefit from image stabilization. So once again, on Sony, I can use Sony's in-body image stabilization, and it helps. You know, I don't think it's not the equivalent of a dedicated built-in 4 or 5 stop image stabilization, but you know, if there's 2 to 3 stops, it certainly made a difference. On this, of course, without any of those aids, it's a little bit harder to do. So, of course, it's not in a Sony E-mount. I would love to see Irix, release there. But in the meantime, if you happen to have bought, say, one of the new Canon EOS R bodies, certainly while you don't get the image stabilization, you do get manual focus aids that helps. And if you're shooting on one of the Nikon Z bodies, depending on which one you have, you may also, along with the focus aids, you may also get image stabilization, VR out of that. And so, a nice trade-off there. So I would say that the greatest limitation is the focal length itself. It's a long focal length, and it means that if you're going to try to do handheld, you can do handheld general purpose shots, and I've got plenty in my gallery that were shot that way, but you're not really going to do handheld macro. It's next to impossible. And beyond that, your keeper rate may not be as high as what you would like. And so that's some of the inherent limitations there. For macro work itself, you're going to be working off a tripod. You're going to be, using live view, and on a tripod, it's no big deal. And so I would say that this is a lens best suited to its original purpose and then sparingly used in other applications, unless you have a kind of camera setup, camera body that gives you more manual focus aids. So moving on to the image quality. I did a second episode where we looked at that and broke down that image quality information in detail. I recommend that you take a look at that here. But a lot of great things to point to on this lens. I compared it again to what I consider a fantastic macro lens, the Canon 150mm F2.8 LIS macro lens. And what I found is that the only place that the Canon was competitive was in the center of the frame, wide open. And as you move off towards the edges, the Irix advantage was very clear. This lens, if you know how to read MTF, let me throw this up here and so you can look at that. There is very, very little drop off as you move off towards the edge of the frame. You can also see from the graph the acutance is very, very high on the lens. And so this is a fantastically sharp lens. And if you stop down to f4, the Irix is just visibly better, both center and definitely at the edges of the frame. It is a optically very, very strong lens. Very good contrast, but I also noted I really felt like there was a great balance between sharpness and contrast and the bokeh quality. Some lenses have such high contrast that the bokeh suffers as a result of it. Get more hard edges. It's not as soft and pleasing. I think Irix has found a fairly close to perfect balance here between sharpness and contrast and then softness of bokeh quality. And as noted, that 11-bladed aperture certainly helps with that as well. I found that chromatic aberrations were essentially non-existent, which is great, particularly longitudinal in a macro type lens. If you have any kind of shiny surface or high contrast surface, if you have longitudinal CA, you get that greener purple fringing, and it really detracts from the image. No issues here. Really, really great performance when it came to that. Beyond that, I did, in some situations, I could create a little bit of flare. And of course, with a long focal length like this, you have to be really intentional about getting a bright light in the frame. And so, with backlit subjects, I had no problems. Like this shot of a pineapple here, you can see very, very brightly backlit, but no issues when it came to that. But when I shot right into the sun, I did introduce wide open, some veiling and a little bit of ghosting. Stop down, you eliminate the veiling, but the ghosting becomes a little bit more evident. And so I don't consider it to be a huge issue, frankly, because again, it's the nature of the lens. You're not going to often be shooting it like I did because the angle of view is narrow enough that that's really going to be the case, particularly when the sun is high up in the sky as it is right now. And so, color looks great. Optically, this is a really, really strong performer. And so once again, the only limitation when it comes to the optics is the nature of the lens itself, that you can have an incredibly sharp lens like this one, but if you're shooting handheld and you don't keep the shutter speed up high enough, motion blur can really rob a lot of that sharpness away. And so if you're shooting handheld, I would recommend that you try to shoot at shutter speeds of 1/250th or faster. I think you're going to get your best results there. And if you drop that shutter speed down too much below that, I found that, and I have quite steady hands, but I found that even at 1/200th of a second, there were situations where I couldn't actually see blur, but I knew that sharpness was diminished so that at a pixel level, there was a little bit of motion blur that was diminishing some of the incredible sharpness from the lens. So once again, it really could have benefited from IS, VR, OS, OSS, whatever you want to call it. Image stabilization would have made a big difference on this particular lens. And so in conclusion, this is a great lens also for shooting video. It's got a great focal length, you know, if you want a long telephoto, but again, you're gonna have to shoot it off a tripod, but it's got a great focus ring, and so the ability to do nice focus pulls, and of course, as we've already discussed, image quality is really fantastic from the lens. So in summation, who is the lens for? I would say that if you want a macro lens to do macro work, this is a great lens. The manual focus aspect is going to work really well. The inclusion of the tripod foot, you know, gives you the ability to really help with the stability in terms of actually balancing the lens and arrangement. It's moderately sized. That longer focal length gives you a little bit more working distance than what a shorter focal length does. And so if you want it for that purpose, I think it's great. If you're someone that does something like food photography or even product photography where space is limited, 150 millimeters may be a little bit too long for you. It's a fairly long focal length, and so you know you might want to consider that. If you want to kind of do a general purpose type lens to do some of shooting portraits, shooting everyday stuff, actually this is a beautiful portrait lens, but again, it's limited because of the nature of manual focus in that application and the lack of image stabilization. So I think that some of the lenses that are around 90 to 100 millimeters that have autofocus and image stabilization are probably better choices for all-around general purpose shooting lenses. However, even in those applications, if you're someone that shoots off of a tripod and you have an opportunity to really kind of finely tweak focus, the results are beautiful from it. Or if you're someone that wants to adapt it to, say, a Sony body, you may also really, really like the results that you can get there. And certainly the price is very reasonable. And so, price to performance ratio is fantastic, but that's within a lab. I mean, just testing it under controlled conditions. Out in the real world, where you might miss focus and you might shake a little bit, those image quality results aren't as good if you don't get those factors right. And so I think that's something to take into consideration. At the end of the day, Irix has done a great job with what's here. There are a few things that aren't here that I would like to see from them. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, I do have a full text review that covers this, maybe a few elements not hit here, along with a lot of data, photos to back up those conclusions. You can also find linkage in the description below to my image gallery and look at photos from the lens. There's buying links down there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. You can also follow me on social media, including now on Instagram, and sign up for my newsletter or become a patron. My patrons get sneak previews of upcoming content and a chance to interact with me in advance of that before the general public gets to see things. So maybe a little bit of a perk there. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.